the environment. And that's when we first met, and become friends and colleagues with her and her job for all these years. Thank you very much for inviting me back. Whenever anyone gives a presentation, whether or not you will be invited back, you don't count on it, but it's always a nice feeling when you're asked to come back again. Last time I really talked about it was at a time when there was a lot of controversy, political controversy. There's still some political controversy, but there was controversy that had spilled over into the question about whether or not climate change was real, whether humans were causing it. And that's what I focused on at that time, showing the evidence with the spectacular photographs of melting glaciers and all the changes that were taking place in the world, and the incredible amount of evidence that's accumulated to show that the cause really is mostly you and me and everybody else on this planet. Tonight I want to do something a little differently. I'll also talk about climate change, but I think I would like to step back one step from climate change, because I don't think we talk about climate change as a problem, and yet the climate change is really more of a symptom of a form of development that we have adopted. It spends very heavily on digging long dead carbon out of the earth, burning it, and putting it in the atmosphere. But that has other consequences as well, as I hope to share with you. So managing fossil fuels is not just about climate change. And as you know, fossil fuels means oil and coal and natural gas. The substances that brought on and helped to transform the world at the time of the Industrial Revolution, based on fire. The discovery of fire was probably 50,000 years ago. And it was a great invention at the time. I'm going to suggest that maybe the time has come to invent something different to supply our energy. So let's just take a look at the benefits we receive from fossil fuels. Coal clearly helped drive the industrial age. The British had been using coal since about the 12th or 13th century. It caused so much air pollution that one king at that time decreed anyone caught burning it would be beheaded. And you thought ISIS had invented this idea. No, a long time ago. It turns out that that didn't happen much because everybody was burning it. And when the king discovered that his own palace was burning it, he decided not to invoke the ultimate penalty on himself, I guess. But only in the late 18th century did coal become sufficiently available that it could begin to displace wood, which is a rather low-value heat source. It doesn't put out a lot of heat for the amount of wood that you have to burn, and coal burns a lot hotter, and that made it possible to do all kinds of things that weren't possible to do before. Oil is valuable to us because of the high energy density. Because there's so much energy stored in a gallon of oil that we can put it in our gas tank and drive. Well, I drove up in my Prius and I got 59 miles per gallon, which is a little low for summertime, but pretty good for wintertime. But you get something out of that. It makes it possible for us to actually have a vehicle that flies through the air. We can carry enough energy in some fuel, an oil-based fuel, that we can actually propel an aircraft through the sky and send ships across the ocean and all the rest of it. Natural gas, which is really the result of decayed vegetable matter that's been trapped underground. It's a gas, as its name implies. It provides heat for buildings and energy for industry and for power generation, electric power generation. So it's proven to be quite useful. In the United States, just to give you a reference, coal is still the largest producer of electricity in the United States. In 2005, slightly over half, 51% of our electricity came from coal. Last year, it was just over 38%. So we're seeing a decline in the use of coal. And it's being displaced by relatively cheap natural gas coming from the fracking process, but even more by inexpensive wind power. and solar power. So we'll take a look at all that in just a moment. And basically what these fossil fuels did was it transformed stationary fire in many useful forms, some of them transportation, that produce heat and work. So we gained a lot of benefits from fossil fuels, no question about it. However, let's talk about health. How many of you have heard of Ebola? Malaria? HIV/AIDS? And then what is the preventable cause of 3.7 million deaths a year? We'll get to that at the end here. But okay, so how many people died in the Ebola crisis, which is horrible. By the way, the Ebola crisis was a horrific thing, and we intervened. We, the world, the rest of the world, that could do something about it, intervened way too late, and many more people died than needed to. And it's a horrible way to die. There's no question about it. But it set off quite a reaction, and we spent something, I think the U.S. alone spent over $6 billion addressing the Ebola crisis. How many people died? Idea? How many? 8,000. And some say that with the tail end of it, it may get up to 10. You know, so about 10. Actually 10,000, not 10 million. 10,000 people. Malaria. How many people die every year from malaria? It's in the hundreds of thousands. It's about 600,000 annually. It's a lot of people to die from malaria. HIV/AIDS, worldwide. It's roughly double malaria, something in that range. And what is the preventable cause of 3.7 million deaths annually? Excess lung and heart deaths from fossil fuel air pollution. Okay, 10,000. 3.7 million. $6 billion spent here, not willing to spend anything to address many more deaths. About half of those, by the way, are just in India and China alone. China's about 1.2 million, and India about half that, so 600,000, so 1.8 million. That's just about half of this. Another population too poor to use fossil fuels that uses crop residues, firewood, and animal dung, about another 3.5 million people a year die from burning those so-called renewable fuels in mostly South Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. So 7 million people die from fire, not from being burned, but just from inhaling the fumes. So that's rather sobering. And when I discovered that, I was a little shocked that that was the case. So it's as I said, fire was a great invention, but this would suggest that we should be a little careful with it. Because one person said, no, it is far more dangerous to stand behind a bus than in front of the bus. Your likelihood of dying is much greater if you stand behind it and breathe fumes. So these are just some things to keep in mind on health. National security. Every 4 years, the Defense Department puts out something called the Department of Defense Quadrennial Review. And in 2014 was the last one that was done, about, I guess it was February or something, just about a year ago. And called the impact of climate change to be threat multipliers that could enable terrorism. What are they talking about here? What they're talking about is, as the climate changes in parts of the world, particularly the Middle East, what it's doing is drying things out. There is no water. Yemen is almost out of water. What's the most unstable place in all of the Middle East? Well, it's a toss-up between Syria and Yemen, but Yemen doesn't even have a government anymore. There's just been a new analysis by security specialists. It's a severe drought in Syria and neighboring regions was one of the major causes, which led to vastly higher food prices, led to the whole Arab Spring. That is, the revolution was really over not getting enough food, or enough food that people could eat. The reason they couldn't get the food is there was no water to grow the food. That raised the price out of the range of what people have, led to this incredible instability. And they go even further and claim that this altered climate was a primary factor in the disintegration, political disintegration of that region and the rise of ISIS. That's a pretty bold statement. I'm not sure I have the evidence to go that far, but this is what people who study these things are saying. It also points out that the military is incurring significant additional costs because of climate change. Sea level rise is affecting something like nearly a dozen major U.S. naval bases around the world. One of them in the Indian Ocean has had to be completely reconfigured. It's on a very low atoll, a very low island, and sea level rise has been enough to make the runway unusable when the waves get over a few feet high. Imagine that wave lapping across the, well, you wouldn't have them here at Manchester Airport, I guess it's far enough inland, but imagine the situation at Logan Airport, which I'm familiar with, which is built on fill in the bay, and it's only a few feet above sea level. So it's only a matter of time before Logan Airport really going to have to have seaplanes landing there, or we'd have to do something to protect the airport from the rising seas. But they've missed another factor that's not in that report, which is they're focusing on climate change, they're not focusing on the fossil fuel part. Let me just ask this question. How many conflicts in the world are either caused by competition for oil and gas or are impossible to solve because of oil and gas? I'll give you a hint. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not one of them. They're fighting over other things. They're disagreeing over other things. It's not oil and gas. But what are the other places? Where else is there conflict in the world? Where? Yes?
In China, fighting over the sea and the islands that are said to have some natural gas on them.
Right, and what's interesting there is we don't even know if it's there. Right, it's the speculation that there is oil and gas in what the Chinese call the South China Sea, and a student of mine from the Philippines calls the West Philippine Sea. Right, that says it all, right? These claims being laid. And so China's in conflict with everyone. Japan. They're in conflict with, of course, Taiwan. That's another old story. Korea. Vietnam. Philippines. Those are the tense ones. But there are also disagreements between China and every other Southeast Asian country that has supposedly an exclusive economic zone 200 nautical miles out from their shore, guaranteed by the law of the sea, that China is claiming the peace of. And so and the thing that we're fighting over those uninhabited rocks is the law of the sea says there shall be a 200 nautical mile distance from the mean high tide mark to an outer boundary over which a nation has economic sovereignty, meaning they have all the resources, fish, oil, gas, minerals, sand, gravel, whatever you dig out of there, that's yours. Other countries can ship their boats over it. They can't fish there unless you let them. They can't dig for oil and gas, and so that's a huge factor. Here's just a list. So I've got China and all the South Sea neighbors down at the bottom, but Iraq, then and now. Does anybody really believe that the war in Iraq had nothing to do with oil and gas? The first Iraqi war, was when Iraq invaded Kuwait to steal a whole chunk of oil land, surface land, because they claimed the Kuwaitis were drilling down and under the border to take out of a big field which they said was theirs. That was the excuse. Well, we intervened in that. And then after that, it's still never been clear to me why we had a second war with Iraq, unless it was over the prospect of getting access to that oil. So Iraq, Sudan and South Sudan. The whole division of Sudan into two countries was over the fact that the South Sudanese were being badly beaten up by the Sudanese of the north, along mostly ethnic lines, racial and ethnic lines, but also because much of the oil is in the south, and the North didn't want to give that up. And the Southerners said they wanted to secede because they didn't like the way they were being treated. So that war dragged on. Darfur, all these places you hear about, an awful lot of it is over gas. In Nigeria, the Niger Delta, where the river Niger comes into the big light there in Africa, There was the Exxon oil spill in Valdez, Alaska. That was 20 some years ago, 25 I think it is. Still damage from that, 25 years later. Okay? And we're about to approve moving ahead to drill in the Arctic, right? Because we know exactly how to do it. And Shell has demonstrated after $4 billion that they've been unable to get a drilling rig into the sea north of Alaska and drill. They crashed one of their drilling rigs. It was just a disaster. And they're about to get approved to do it again because they know how to do it. The BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, pretty bad. The largest oil spills in history, except for the fact, my Nigerian colleagues tell me, that in 1 year, there's as much oil spilled in Nigeria as the BP oil spill was. It's not a single spill, it's the thousands of spills because of the really sloppy way the drilling is done there, and there are no environmental standards or reasons to clean up. About 3 years ago, the company that wants to build the XL pipeline had a pipeline that ran across, bringing some of the bitumen, it's called, the fuel from the tar sands, all the way across the northern part of southern Canada, the northern part of the U.S. It broke in Michigan. After 3 years, they have spent $1 billion trying to clean it up. It's nowhere near being cleaned up. So that's pretty serious. We better figure this out before we do it. Maybe it'd be a good idea just to figure it out. And as they say, there's the Nigeria taking oil spills. Well, this is what the Canadian tar sands look like. And Prime Minister Harper keeps saying, "Oh, don't worry, we will restore it." By the way, the trees that were cut down, this is one of the largest boreal forests in the world. You can see there, believe it or not, there used to be trees here. Those trees were cut down, and under an industry sustainability program, they were listed as sustainably harvested. Because instead of throwing them away or burning them, they sold them as lumber. Do you see any new trees coming in there that are likely to fill that in? No, not either. Anyway, it's really quite a mess, and all of that water is toxic. So migratory birds, one of the major migratory bird routes in North America, when birds land there, many of them die. It's just so toxic.
Where is that?
This is in Alberta, Canada, in the region where they're digging up all this oil sands. It has, takes a huge amount of energy. They burn clean natural gas to make steam, to push it down in the ground, melt it. And I call it tar. They call it oil sands, but it's really tar because it's like asphalt. It's like solid asphalt, and you have to heat it and melt it and pump it out of the ground. That takes a huge amount of energy. And so there's this big discussion about does this have more carbon dioxide associated with it than ordinary oil? The answer is yes, it does, right? Because it takes so much more energy to get it out of the ground. And anyway, that's what they've chosen to do. This is fracking in Pennsylvania, the so-called Marcellus shale. If you have a nice little farm, you end up with things like this near your farm, huge amounts of industrial development. And by the way, the oil where this is being done this way out in North Dakota, they're finding that each well, many of the wells, not each well, but many of the wells are only producing less than 60%, or they've lost 60% of their production after 1 year. So it means you have to go over and drill another one, and another one, and another one. We're punching the earth full of these holes and pumping these nasty chemicals down and assuming nothing will happen. Well, things are beginning to happen. Even in Oklahoma, which loves oil and gas, they have actually an oil well on the grounds of the Capitol building to demonstrate their love of oil. They had a fairly serious earthquake. And in Ohio, they've had a number of earthquakes. And they've all now been traced to pouring all this liquid down, which then lubricates these fracture zones and allows them to slip. So this is what we're doing in order to have cheap gas, and cheap natural gas and cheap gasoline. And then here's mountaintop removal in West Virginia. Some 55 mountains have been removed like this. Due to a quirk in the law, first of all, the strip-lined mining law doesn't apply because these are mountains, not flat areas. So that's a loophole. And secondly, they are allowed, after they have removed what they call the overburden. By the way, you can see back here, this is what that's forested trees on it. But what they do is they remove the overburden, meaning soil, and they just dump it down in the valleys, down in the streams, damming and polluting the streams, because there are a lot of acidic material and other chemicals that come out of the ground when you dig for this coal. So you end up with these incredible gashes all over the landscape. Here you can see forest in the foreground. These hills used to be covered in the forest like that. Okay, well, that's what we're doing to get our fossil fuels these days. Here's what I think kind of interesting. This is from West Virginia. Here is a place where they've been stripping the hillsides. There's so much sludge after they dewater it, after they take the water out of it. That's in a 2.8 billion gallons of toxic coal sludge in there. This little thing, if that breaks, there's going to be a huge flood coming right down here, and here's an elementary school. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind my kids going to there, and I hope you wouldn't want to be a kid going to that elementary school 15 years ago. So, but that's the way it is, all over this place, all over this world. And we do that, and we don't think a thing about it. It's just, it's not that much in the news. So, and then there's climate change. Okay? So I just wanted to lay that out, that if you step back and look at fossil fuels, there are a lot of negatives about fossil fuels. And we can get the energy services we're not getting from fossil fuels in a lot of other ways, and we are getting them with increasing amounts. I'll show you, talk about that as we begin. So then there's climate change. Now, there's an urgent goal. We've already raised the Earth's temperature about 1 degree Celsius. It's about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. The Arctic has increased by about 4 degrees Fahrenheit. We'll see the consequences of that in a moment. And the international community has said we should not let it rise more than 2 degrees Celsius, or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has identified the total amount of carbon dioxide that can be emitted to meet that goal. And if we were to follow that rule, we would leave more than 3/4 of all the known oil, coal, and gas in the ground. We just would never mine it or drill it. It would require, just to put it in perspective, the amount that we could burn between now and the end of the time we burn fossil fuels is about another, say, 28 to 30 years at current rates. That's about it. If we burn that much, then we would stay. We have a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees. There's the challenge. And then people say, well, we'll burn trees instead. We'll burn wood to make our electricity. And you can do that. The only trouble is that you produce about 50% more carbon dioxide when you burn wood to make electricity than if you burn coal. Now, who here does not love wood burning fire on a coal plant? I think we all do. Many of us have homes that have wood stoves and fireplaces. Fireplaces, by the way, are a real heat leak in a lot of ways. You probably don't want those. Wood stoves are terrific, provided that you have a really efficient stove and you have a really efficient house in which you burn it. And it really helps if you have an outside air intake, because you bring in cold air. You don't just suck the air, you just heat it back up the chimney with the fire. So there are ways you can burn wood very efficiently and stay warm. But making electricity is not that. The most you can get is heat to electricity is about 25%. The average coal plant in the U.S. gets about 31 or 32%. The very best, most modern coal plants, which by the way are only being built in China these days, get about 40%. 40% of the heat comes from electricity. With wood, it's only 25%. And typically, it's less than 20%. So that's not a direction we need to go. I'm going to Washington tomorrow to testify before the Environmental Protection Agency to explain to them why this is such a bad idea, because they're talking about doing this to meet their climate goals. So now, just a brief refresher on greenhouse effect and how it works. The sun puts visible light into the earth. The earth absorbs it. Some of it gets reflected by clouds, some gets reflected by the surface, some gets absorbed. The earth warms up, and as the earth warms up, it radiates heat back to space. It's on a hot July day when you're crossing a black asphalt street, you can just feel that heat headed for outer space. It comes right up in your face, right? We've all experienced it. But there are gases in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels being among them, and they absorb that radiant heat. And they re-radiate some of it back down and some of it back to outer space. So the net effect is that just tell you this, all these numbers will be on the final exam. You just have to remember the left-hand side and the right-hand side. This is only to show that we actually know these numbers. How much energy is coming in from the sun? How much is being reflected? How much is being absorbed? So that's 161 watts per square meter. That's the equivalent of 1.600 watt light bulbs over every square meter, square yard. But what's being absorbed here and getting radiated back is 333, or just about twice as much. We're getting heated by these gases in the atmosphere as we're getting directly from the sun. Now, this, of course, originates with what was in the sun, because it came down here and came back up again. And so it would decrease over time if we shut off the sun part. But it's amazing how much heat we're getting back from this trapping of heat. If you've ever been in front of a fireplace that has glass doors, you don't feel anything. You understand? If you open the glass doors, you feel it. This idea of the heat trapping was called the greenhouse effect by a French physicist back in 1827. But if he had done this work in 1927, he would have called it the hot car effect. Everybody experienced the hot car effect. You go out on a day, it's 75 degrees, you get in the car, it's 130. Okay? I should have put it in a slide. There's one that shows an oven with a little dog sitting in it. Said, putting your dog in a car on a hot day is like putting it in the oven. Don't cook your dog or your child. Tragic cases of children being left in cars. It gets so hot that living things die. You can read that, it really is a real phenomenon. So you don't have to believe in global warming, but if you believe in the hot car effect, you understand what is happening with the planet. The carbon moves around, and the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is about 800 billion tons of carbon. About 600 billion tons is in growing plants. There's about 2,000 billion tons in soils. Trees pull out about 120, we emit from burning fossil fuels about 8 billion tons a year. Trees take up about 122 billion tons. They emit 60 because trees breathe, they exhale as well as inhale. And soils exhale about 60. So trees and soils, 60 plus 122 minus 60 is 2. About 2 billion tons of carbon are absorbed by trees and soil every year net out of this age. So about 1/4 of everything we emit, there's an amount of carbon dioxide pulled out of the air that is about 1/4 of the amount that we emit every year. It's a good thing. The oceans likewise absorb about 2 billion tons more than they release every year. So 2 here and 2 here means 4 out of 8, or half, of all the carbon dioxide that we emit is taken out of the air every year by the ocean and plants and soils. It's not that we aren't releasing some as well. We do have deforestation, putting roughly 1 back in again. So we're putting in a total of 9, and we're taking out 4, so a little less than half. Very disturbing news item today. Studies in the Amazon over 30 years show that the good news was that the Amazon was storing more carbon out of the atmosphere every year up until about 1995, and today it's storing about half that much. So this friendly helper here of sucking up carbon dioxide may not be so helpful in the future. It means we've got to be a little more careful with what we're doing. This is just showing, this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, showing that over 10,000 years, carbon dioxide was relatively low. This is amount in the atmosphere, 250 parts per million, that's 0.025%. And it rose a little bit over time, and then it just soared. This is just a dramatic increase in the last about 150 years. Likewise, methane was going down, it began to rise a little bit, and then it more than doubled in about 150 years. And nitrous oxide, pretty low, and then it rose suddenly. That's occurring because of all the nitrogen fertilizer we're putting on plants. So these are dramatic changes. We are changing the planet atmosphere. This carbon dioxide is going in the oceans and making it more acidic. I don't know if you saw the piece in the Boston Globe earlier this month about how oyster farmers in Maine are having high mortality rates of their the little larvae when they first come out. 80% loss rate. Normally they have about a 20% loss rate. All they have to do is neutralize some of the acid, and they get back to their 80% survival rate. So we're changing the ocean in a way that means it's not going to be productive. I just had a wonderful dinner with sea scholars. There will not be any more sea scholars one of these days. And the ocean is acidic enough that scholars cannot make shells. No more lobster dinners. That then affects the entire structure of the ocean. So these are issues that we're facing. Now, this is just a long-term reconstruction of temperatures going back 1,000 to the year 1,000. So it's from 1,000 to 2,000, as you see. Now, the blue dot right there means that was the temperature in that year. 0 is essentially from, I think it's 1940 to 1980. It's this 40-year smooth average is this line here. And you can see, if we define the climate as a 30 or 40-year average, the climate is this black line, it goes up and down. The annual weather are these blue spikes and tips showing what the temperature was doing during those times. So here we go from the year 1000, 1800 to 1900 right here. And if, I don't know, you can't see much is happening there. It may be going down a little, ups and downs. Then red means we have a thermometer, and that's what's happened. So in the last 100 years, we saw this dramatic, it was the 20th century, we saw this dramatic increase in temperature rise. Corresponding with the rise of all those heat-trapping gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So notice that the warmest year in the 20th century is 1998. It is the only year in the 20th century that is in the top 15 years of the 21st century. So it's counting 2000 as the first year of the 21st century. So all of them are pretty much clustered in the last 17 years. Here is a temperature record showing this is the thermometer going up to 1880. This is a warm year, this is a cool year, this is a warm year. These are all El Nino years, warm years when the Pacific Ocean gives us extra heat. These are La Nina years when the Pacific Ocean is cooler, and that cools down the whole planet a little bit. But the total amount of heat is still the same on the Earth, it's just sometimes it's in the ocean and you can't measure it, sometimes it's at the surface and we do. So this is what we're measuring, well, sometimes called the surface temperature measurement. You can see up here a lot of warm years. Here's that 1998 year, and it's right up there with this cluster of very warm years. Here's 2014, just slightly above, making it the warmest year on record by a narrow margin. Now, I can see the skeptical look on your face. I've been living in New Hampshire. It was a pretty damn cold winter. I live in Boston. It was an unbelievably snowy winter. We are still, I mean, finally I can back out of my driveway and see whether a car is coming. Whereas I wasn't able to do that from mid-January on. I mean, the snow was piled so high. How can it be that we were so cold that this could be the warmest year, the 2014, that could have been the warmest year? I mean, through December, January, so forth. How could this be that this is the warmest year? Senator Inhofe, who chairs the Environment and Public Works Committees from Oklahoma, prominent climate skeptic, actually spoke on the floor of the Senate and says, "What's this global warming nonsense?" With that, he unwrapped a snowball and threw it to the chair of the Senate and said, "You see, this can't possibly cool global warming because we have snowballs here." Well, it turns out that what we had was, and I have a former student in Iceland, and she wrote to me and she said, "I see you're getting a lot of snow in Boston. We haven't even had below freezing winter yet." Another colleague from Alaska, "We have not had either snow or cold weather yet." You're all familiar with the Iditarod dog sled race. Had to be moved 500 miles north of Anchorage to start. There was no snow. It hadn't been cold enough to snow where they often have this race. So we had this fluky thing where this wedge of cold air came right down sort of the middle of the United States to the East Coast and down to around Tennessee, and it just stayed here for 2 months. And we had these incredibly cold temperatures that the rest of the world didn't want. So that's, by the way, this February worldwide, which was cold here, snowy here, was I think the second warmest on record worldwide. So you have to look at the total picture. So 9 of the past 12 months have been either the warmest or second warmest in this period. And here's an interesting way to look at this. There are a lot of people in this room who are less than 38 years of age. Okay? There are only a few of us. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I see 6, 7, 8, maybe 8, 10. It might be 10 of us who are over 38 years of age. If you're less than 38 years of age, you have never experienced a month in your life that was cooler than the average for that month in the 20th century. In other words, every month, if you were March, this is March. Every March for the last 38 years, I mean, if you go through, I mean, if you're less than 38 years old, go back 38 years, none of those Marches are as cool as the average March for the 20th century. Okay? That's an astounding way to look at this and to realize how we've transformed the climate system in a very short period of time. All right, other measures. Global precipitation has increased overall, even though there have been droughts in some places. The percentage of extreme precipitation events has changed. For example, the snow we've had this year, that's an extreme precipitation event. It was so funny in Boston, everyone was complaining about the snow, and then when somebody at the Weather Channel announced, "You're only 2 inches short of the record," everybody said, come on, it's gonna come, and it did. We managed to get 108.6 inches, which broke the previous record, and everybody, despite all the shoveling and the complaining and the snow blowing and everything, said, "Oh yeah, we finally did it. We're real New Englanders now. We flew through a record." But in a study that was done, it turns out that if you look at all precipitation events and you say, what is an extreme event? So you need a definition for that. And the definition that the meteorologists use is the amount of rain that appears in the top 1% of precipitation events. And it turns out in New England, that has increased. The amount of precipitation that comes in the top 1% of events has increased by 71% since 1970. That's a huge change. That's just a different world, right? It means deluges. It means snowstorms like we just had. So that's a factor. And then, so wet areas are becoming wetter, drier, and that's a big change. Now here I mentioned how warm it's gotten in the Arctic. In 2012, half of the Arctic ice was gone by the warmest by the end, before it started refreezing. That was September 16, 2012. If you look at the trend over time for the month of September, going back to 1979 when we first had satellites, it goes up and down, but it's gone from an average of around 8 million square kilometers in 1979 to about 4 in 2012. That's half. One and a half. Think of it as a thermometer. It's a thermometer, right? That line is the thermometer that tells you that the Earth is warming, and it's very sensitive. Just the other day, February 25th, was the maximum extent in winter, and that we have lost this what is that, 350 square miles. These yellow areas are areas that are not frozen, that normally are frozen if you look at the average over the 1979 to 2014 period. So these we've lost in the winter, and we've lost in the summer. Sea levels are rising because glaciers are melting, not the Arctic ice, but the glaciers from the land, from Antarctica and Greenland. And these are the old records going back to 1970. We now have satellites that can measure the sea level of the whole world to within about 1 millimeter every day. Amazing. At least as intelligent as your smartphone, right? Very, very clever. And it just keeps rising up and up. And we're talking about if there's a set of glaciers and part of the ice sheet in West Antarctica that is now become unconnected. And over the next decades, maybe century or so, it will go into the ocean, where it will raise the ocean by 12 feet. That's a lot of snow. Go to Disney World in Florida now. Disney, right? It's not going to be there in the future. So big changes. So were these caused by climate change? Here are some examples. In 2010, an area about the size of 1/5 of Pakistan was flooded. Combination of monsoons changing direction and drastic melt of glaciers. 20 million people displaced. Well, in California, in 2014, third year, we're now in the fourth year as a drought in California. It's just running dry. I used to go skiing a couple of times out in the Sierras, not far from here in the Sierra Mountains. And the first time I called about a dozen years ago, and I said, gee, I have a spring break coming up, I'd like to go out cross-country ski. There's not much snow here in New England. How much snow do you have? And the lady said, oh, about 12 to 14. And I said, that's a little thin, isn't it? She said, no, feet. 12 to 14 feet of snow. We went out and there was 12 or 14 feet of snow. We were skiing over the tops of some cottages. It was amazing. Called up this year, 0 snow in the Sierras at the spot. 0, absolutely 0. There is no snow. There will be no water in the spring and through the summer. 12% of our table food comes from the San Joaquin Valley. It will not have any water. Get ready to take it a lot more for everything from lettuce, tomatoes, all vegetables, fruits, everything that comes from California. It's happening. Hurricane Sandy. Here it is heading up over Florida and heading up to the East Coast. As you know, it crashed into New Jersey and New York City. Estimated damage is about $65 billion. And the insurance industry is not a skeptic of climate change. They are absolutely certain about it. They still don't have, they just got some of the subway stations operating again in New York City after Sandy, because of the damage. Here you can see the kind of damage. And so what happens is insurance companies now say we won't insure anyone who wants to live out on an island like this. That's true here of Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. It's true of Block Island and off Rhode Island. It's true of much of the Florida coast, the Gulf Coast. And so good citizens run to their congressman and say, hey, we can't get insurance. And their congressman says, well, I want you to vote for me, so therefore I'll pass a law that says that the government will subsidize your insurance. So now they can get insurance here for less than they were paying the private sector. And we've gone from privatizing risk to socializing risk. That is, all of society bears the risk, not just the people who live here. Those are trends. We have to figure out what we're going to do with it. How are we going to live with this? I feel sorry for people this happens to, but I only feel sorry for them once. And I'd be willing to pay them once if they would move and never come back again. But I don't see anybody doing that, right? I don't see anybody. Okay, let me just move along. This was a terrible pair of typhoons that hit in subsequent years the Philippines. And ironically, each one hit while government diplomats were negotiating a climate treaty. And the delegate from the Philippines during Typhoon Haiyan went on a hunger strike, quite dramatic, in Lima, Peru, and convinced other developing countries that they had to take action, just like the Philippines, and China would have to take action. Everybody would have to take action to address this problem. Because the force of this hurricane, it's not that we're seeing more typhoons and hurricanes, the ones we're seeing are much stronger because the oceans are warmer. What drives a hurricane or a typhoon, the same ones in the Atlantic or the Pacific, is the heat of the ocean. There's more heat. In fact, we think that 85% of the heat we're getting is going in the ocean, but we're not even sensing it on that. So this is a concern. Here's Boston in February, and this dramatic one, and also in Bedford, right near the university. That's great, quite dramatic. Snow devils blowing around and so forth. And so we were getting the excess precipitation associated with the warmer Gulf Stream, which was evaporating more water, hitting that tongue of cold air that was coming down from the Arctic and producing ice and snow. So all of these things are happening, and here you can just see the changes. On the left is from 1901, you look at the average over a century, and then you look at the average over the second half century, you can see an acceleration. That is, much more has happened in the last 60 years than happened averaged over the previous 110 years. Insurance industry is just showing the increase in the number of events and the damage costs. And then this very disturbing research that came out in 2009 saying that climate change that takes place due to an increase in carbon dioxide is largely irreversible for 1,000 years after emissions stop. So a lot of people say, well, if we don't like it, we'll just stop and we'll do things differently. But you can't, unless we have a mechanism for sucking all that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, we're not going to be able to do anything about it. So it's an irreversible thing for a long time. It's not just my generation bequeathing this to you, it's all of us bequeathing it to whatever that is, how many generations are there? Let's say four generations, 100 years, and that's 40 generations. The next 40 generations get what we bequeath. And so, so that's the challenge. Now I think, yeah. Let me just close here with a little model. If everybody will bear with me for about 5 minutes, I'll run through this very quickly. This is a model put together by MIT, and it just has carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere from some source. Could be from forest cutting, from burning fossil fuels. Some of it goes into the ocean, some goes into the atmosphere, some of it comes back out, some of it goes into trees. And here's the story. This is the message I want you to come away with. If we follow the business as usual path, and we say we really want to stay below 2 degrees, we have to stay somewhere about a concentration like this. So this is how much is in the atmosphere, this is how much we're emitting. So here we emit, and it goes up, and this will take us up. Here's the quite a, what's that, about a tripling or something, carbon dioxide in 2100. This is what the concentrations in the atmosphere look like. They keep going up and up and up. And so the reason for that is that we have a faucet here that's carbon dioxide going in. We have various drains on the bathtub. We're just putting it in faster than the drain can take it out. So even if we were to stop and hold it constant, you see, here's what's happening. And hold it constant, we would find So we'll hold it constant and then start to reduce it. And what happens is, not very much, because we're still exceeding the rate at which the trees and the soils and the ocean can take it up. So you can see that over here. There's still, emissions are higher than removals. So we basically end up with still more in the atmosphere than we currently have. So what will it take to get below 450 parts per million? Basically, what we have to do is we have to immediately start reducing by about 80%. And then what happens is we end up right on the target. And if we want to do better than that, that's because, because the rate at which we're putting it in becomes equal to the rate at which it can be taken out from natural processes. So our bathtub is now balanced. We have a constant level in it. Our carbon dioxide bathtub is being drained at the rate it's being filled. Now, if we want to do better than that, we can plant more trees. We can put more, that purple on the right called sequestration is there. And basically, if we do that, we will start sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And it will actually go down. So that's the basic message, that everything will play out. And here were two pieces of end of the year news. Data from the International Energy Agency indicates that global emissions of carbon dioxide from the energy sector stalled in 2014, marking the first time in 40 years in which there was a halt or reduction in emissions of the greenhouse gas that was not tied to economic downturn. In fact, what happened was the economy increased in the world by 3%, and there was no decrease, or no increase in carbon dioxide. And that's good, because you've just learned that doesn't mean that the rock is wrong. We're still increasing, because we're still increasing faster than, but it's a great first step. So China gets a lot of credit because they reduced their emissions by 2%, more use of wind and solar, and less use of coal. Bad news, in today's New York Times, Amazon forest becomes less of a climate change safety net. The uptake of carbon dioxide in the Amazon peaked in the 90s, and it's fallen by half. That's the bad news. Well, governments are racing to get a treaty. Here's energy for the 21st century. Germany now gets 28% of its energy from these kind of sources. They had a little scare the other day because there was a total eclipse of the sun. And they had to figure out what was going to happen when the sun didn't shine on the solar panels for about four or 5 minutes totally. And it was getting cut down over a period of an hour or so on either side of that. They managed to weather it okay. This is the house that my wife and I built, which is completely run by solar. It's here, it's in Massachusetts, right on the Vermont border. It has all solar panels. It produces all the electricity needed for all lighting, all appliances, all heat in New England winter, all hot water, well pump, everything. And over the year, we're connected to the grid. At night, we draw from the grid. In the day, we produce and send our surplus to the grid. Over the year, we produce as much as we use. The total house uses about 70% as much electricity in a year for everything that the average house uses just for lights and appliances. So this can be done. This is real technology in real time. And so here is this going to be, this is energy for the 20th century. And the other picture I've showed you is energy for the 21st century. So I think it can be done. I think we can address it. I think we can get off fossil fuels. And I'd say for our health, for the well-being of the surface of our planet, and for the quality of our atmosphere and oceans, the sooner we can do it, the better. Thank you.
We can have a few questions.
Two easy questions. Realizing Antarctica is about 2.5 times the size of the United States. I've read different articles that if Antarctica completely melted over the next, not going to, but say it completely melted over the next 5 years, as well as Greenland. One article said the oceans would rise about 50 feet, another one said about 200 feet.
Yes.
Which of those is?
They're making different assumptions about how much would actually go into the ocean. Some of it might stay because there's a kind of a hole, and whether or not the ice would melt and come out of that hole or not. I think that's the difference. But if you look at the total amount of ice, it's 200 feet, 200 feet of sea level rise.
The other question is about Jim Inhofe and the Republican Party. Do you think he really believes the nonsense that global warming is the greatest hoax ever foisted upon the human race, or is he doing it because big oil and big coal supplied lots of money to the Republican Party, so they keep spewing that nonsense? Is he a true believer or just a money?
No, it's hard to know. The statement that always strikes me is whenever a politician who doesn't choose to believe in climate change, the notion of believing or not believing is a funny one. I once had a reporter who asked me if I believed in climate change, and I said, yes, and I also believe in peanut butter sandwiches. They both exist, right? I mean, I don't have to have a belief system to know that the peanut butter sandwich exists. I don't need to have a belief system. I just have to believe the evidence, okay? It's hard to know. I never thought it was safe or fair to attribute motives to people when I don't know what their inner thinkings are, but it's very clear that there's a very strong correlation between members of Congress who receive large campaign donations from fossil fuel companies are overwhelmingly opposed to addressing climate change, and people who do not receive those generally seem to think we should be addressing it. And I'll just leave that as the evidence on the table. Yes, Roger? Wait, here comes the microphone.
I guess it's more of a policy question. Every election is about the incumbent, and the incumbent president has a plan to reduce emissions of CO2. That plan comes out in June.
Yep.
In the heat of the presidential primary, where 8 or 9 candidates in the Republican Party will be running against the incumbent. So what should students and others do in the face of candidates running for president who are going to be calling for the repeal of this president's EPA Clean Power Plan?
Well, let me answer that with a story I think is really appropriate for New Hampshire presidential primaries. When John McCain was running in the primaries here in New Hampshire, a group of people organized, and they made sure there were people at every one of his rallies who asked a question about what his position was on climate change. John McCain did not win the presidency, but when he got back to the Senate, he co-sponsored with Joseph Lieberman a climate act. It was a cap and trade system to address climate change. I mean, John McCain got it. He understood it. He really he knew that that he was informed that there was an issue, and his political instinct said, well, if I'm hearing this in New Hampshire, it must be true, or something like that. So one thing to do is to get the message to the candidates that climate change is a problem. I mean, if I were living in Florida and the governor said that no one in my administration can utter the words climate change, and Florida is the most vulnerable state in the nation to sea level rise, I would work to get myself into government. The same in North Carolina, where the legislature passed a law saying that coastal counties could not consider climate change and rising sea level when they planned for future management of the coastal regions of North Carolina. I mean, it seems like a death wish to me. I'm sorry, I just don't get it. I think you have to be realistic, and let's use the information we have to manage the best way we can. Sure, there must be a student who has a stone to throw or a comment to make or something. Here's one back there.
Sir, I was interested in what your thoughts are on nuclear energy, perhaps using that to sort of cut out coal's share of the energy group.
Mm-hmm. Nuclear energy surely has the advantage that it does not produce much of any greenhouse gas, any carbon dioxide when it runs. There is some carbon dioxide reduced in the production of the fuel, to enrich the fuel, but it's, you know, it's not as good as wind and solar, but it's a whole lot better than coal. The issues, I think, with nuclear power are, well, with Fukushima, when something goes wrong, it really goes wrong, right? It's really a serious problem. Secondly, why are we in this tense relationship with Iran over what they can do with their nuclear fuel? Hey, they just want to do what the International Treaty on Nuclear Power says they can do, is enrich uranium to have nuclear power plants to have electricity. This is a country that has oil and gas that they can burn from now till almost the end of time, but nevertheless, they need it for electricity production, and we have poor people and we have to give them electricity. Our biggest other adversary on this is North Korea, which basically has gone with a peaceful nuclear power plant turned it into a nuclear weapon. So we're going to have to make a decision. You know, are those? The other thing is now the king of Saudi Arabia wants one. General Sisi in Egypt wants one. I'm not sure I want to have nuclear power plants sprinkled around unstable parts of the world where they are targets of terrorists and bombs and everything else. So I think we have to be judicious in how we use nuclear power. And I'm not saying it shouldn't be used or couldn't be used, but I just don't want to see one in every street corner. I think there are some issues that really need to be addressed. And we've not even come close to solving the waste problem. So if we could do all that, nuclear power would be a great alternative. And it may be useful for this big base power problem that we may have if we decide to really get out of using coal entirely, for example. Yes, yes.
So if you came and you talked to us about the poverty, the hunger that's in Manchester, we could do something. We could go to a soup kitchen, volunteer there. But what can I, a 2-year-old, or we as staying at some college, do about this issue?
Good question. I mean, there are things that can be done. It's an excellent question. I think we all tend to feel helpless in the face of an issue this big and this complicated. On the other hand, each one of us, are the consumers of this fossil fuel energy, right? And so how we manage our own personal use is a start. Getting our institutions or our workplaces to do something about it is another start. I don't know whether there's a fossil fuel divestment program here at St. Anselm, but there is at a lot of colleges and universities. And that's, you know, I think symbolically that's really important, but I think it would be even better would be for colleges and universities to invest in alternative energies that doesn't produce any carbon dioxide. We're all familiar with the Cape Wind project. You know, they're going to build this big wind turbine project out in Cape Cod Bay. And that's all completely on hold right now because the two companies that were going to buy 3/4 of the electricity have pulled out. They're pushing a big pipeline across from fracked Marcellus gas in Pennsylvania across Massachusetts, southern New Hampshire, which is south of here, by the way, over to Drigget, and then we would have all this natural gas which we could burn and make electricity. It turns out if we had Cape Wind, we wouldn't need that pipeline. $6 billion we're going to spend on a pipeline, and maybe we should be in a position of not bringing on new fossil fuel use. That would be my argument. One thing I'm suggesting every place I speak is, how about getting all colleges and universities to agree that they would buy the electricity from Cape Wind? Have a guaranteed market for it. Then it could be resurrected. And it could be built. All the permits have been approved. And it took 10, 12 years of court cases, some of them very frivolous. And in fact, the judge finally said, enough is enough. And said, go ahead and vote it. So there are things at that level. So acting individually, acting socially in the people and institutions you touch. I mean, just learning about this and figuring out how you can do things differently so it didn't require so much fossil fuels in your life or mine, and help your friends to do the same.
Yes, the important
negotiations taking place in Paris in December.
Yes.
And I'd like you to comment on the international relations approach.
Um, Why am I not surprised that Professor Bondo would ask a question like that? That's right. They need this, right? This will be on the final exam? Okay, I'll give you an answer. All right. Yes, as you just heard, governments are busy negotiating in earnest now after 2 typhoons hitting the Philippines in a row. And they had a very successful meeting in Geneva that ended in mid-February. And there will be two more of those before the meeting in Paris in December. These negotiations have been going on for over 20 years. We got a framework convention that said it's a problem, we'll report what we're emitting, and we'll meet every year. And we'll have a set of rules for how we meet and so on. And then we had the Kyoto Protocol, which the US opted not to be part of, which basically said this country shall reduce by this amount.